Sir, you open that door. Lady, you open it. You die with the rest of us. But Claire Whitmore's hand was already on the lock. Sir, 10 men were freezing to death on the highway outside her shop. Every voice in her head, the town, the whispers, the warning screamed at her to let them. Hell's angels. Holes. The men decent people crossed the street to avoid. She had 30 seconds to choose whether a widow alone in a blizzard should risk everything for strangers, wearing the patches her whole town feared. Of Daniel, and she turned the lock. If you believe one act of kindness can change a life, stay with me until the very end and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I can see just how far this story travels tonight. The first thing Claire Whitmore did when the emergency alert screamed across her phone was reach for the light switch. Second thing she did was freeze because through the rattling window of Whitmore Auto Repair, she heard a sound that did not belong to any storm. Double engines, not the smooth hum of a car crawling home before the snow. These were coughing engines, the kind that clawed at the air. Motorcycles, 10 of them, maybe more. And they were out there in a blizzard the radio had already called the worst in 40 years. So she whispered to no one. No. Not tonight. She had spent the last hour convincing herself she was doing the smart thing. At the shop, kill the lights, slip into the storm shelter Daniel built into the back of the garage 3 winters before the cancer took him. He'd poured concrete on his hands and knees while she brought him coffee and told him he was building a bunker for a war that would never come. Better a bunker we never need, he'd said, than a night we wish we had one. She hadn't understood him then. Understood him now. Claire pressed her forehead to the cold glass and stared out at the highway, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Headlights, bubbling, falling. One of the motorcycles went down. She heard the scrape of metal even through the double-paned window, even over the howl of the wind. A rider hit the ground and slid as the bike spun away from him across the ice, and the man did not get up. Up, she breathed. Come on, get up. He didn't get up. Their riders were slowing, circling back, but they were struggling too. She could see it in the way their headlights swayed and stuttered, the way the beams kept dropping toward the ground and jerking back up. These men were not cruising. These men were fighting for their lives, and they were losing. Claire's whole body went rigid. This is not your problem. That was the town's voice. They recognized it instantly because she'd heard it her entire life. It was the voice of Pastor Reeves, who'd once told a full congregation that certain elements were poisoning the county. It was the voice of Sheriff's Deputy Carl Dunphy, like to say that men in leather jackets were one bad night away from a body count. It was the voice of every neighbor who'd ever leaned across a fence and murmured that word like it was a diagnosis. Angels, they'll rob you. Her sister Marlene had told her once when a group of riders had rolled through town 2 summers back. They'll rob you and worse, Claire. And there won't be a soul to help you way out on that highway. Way out on that highway. That was where Claire lived. That was where Daniel had built their whole life, from town, on a stretch of road that saw more deer than people. It had felt like heaven when Daniel was alive. It had felt like a prison since he died. But now it felt like a decision. The man on the ground still hadn't moved. Claire's hand, the one that had been reaching for the light switch that was supposed to be turning off the shop and hiding her away, curled into a fist and then went still. Daniel, she said out loud, and her voice cracked on his name the way it always did. Daniel, what do I do? She already knew what he'd say. Was the terrible thing about loving a good man for 18 years. His voice never left you. It just sat in your chest like a second heartbeat, and it spoke up at the worst possible moments. People are more important than things. Everything else is just weather. She grabbed her coat. The wind hit her like a wall when she shoved the shop door open. It ripped the breath straight out of her lungs and drove ice into her face like buckshot. And for 1 second, she nearly turned around. 1 second where the smart, grief-shrunken part of her almost won. Then a voice shouted through the storm, a man's voice, ragged and desperate. Mitch, stay with me. Sir, don't you close your eyes. And Claire ran. She ran toward the fallen man, toward the huddle of riders trying to lift him, the exact thing she'd spent her whole life being told to run away from. Her boots slid on the ice. The cold turned her fingers to wood. And somewhere in that 50-foot sprint across the frozen lot, a woman who had been afraid of almost everything since her husband died stopped being afraid of one thing. Claire saw her coming, and every one of them went still. There were, she registered dimly, a lot of them. Big men made bigger by leather and cold. Faces she couldn't read behind frost-crusted beards and ice-glazed goggles. On their backs, plain as a warning, the winged skull. Patches her town had taught her meant danger. One of them stepped in front of her, enormous 6'4" at least, shoulders like a doorframe, a gray-streaked beard packed with snow. His eyes were the flat, careful eyes of a man who had learned the hard way to expect the worst from strangers. "Liddy," he said, and his voice was surprisingly quiet under all that wind. "Sir, you need to get back inside. This ain't—" "He's dying," Claire said. A big man blinked. "Your friend. On the ground. He's going into shock, and you're standing here explaining things to me." She was already pushing past him, dropping to her knees beside the fallen rider. "Move. Let me see him." Nobody moved. For one horrible heartbeat, she thought they might stop her. Thought maybe Marlene was right. Maybe Pastor Reeves was right. Maybe she'd just run out into a blizzard and knelt down in front of exactly the kind of men everyone warned her about. And the big one said, "Do what she says." And they moved. Ellen Ryder was young. That was the first thing that broke something open in her chest. Sopped under the ice and the leather and the blood, he couldn't have been more than 25. His helmet had cracked. His right leg was bent at an angle that made her stomach turn, and his lips had gone a shade of blue she'd only ever seen once before. A face she'd sat beside in a hospital for 11 weeks. "Mitch," she said, because she'd heard them shout it. "Mitch, can you hear me? Look at me, sweetheart. Open your eyes." His lids fluttered. "There you are." She stripped off her own coat and pressed it over his chest, and she felt every man around her flinch at this stranger giving up her own warmth to a boy she'd never met. "You stay awake for me. You hear? You've got a whole crew here who came back for you in the middle of hell, so you do not get to quit on them now." "Who?" The young rider slurred. Claire said, "I'm nobody. Stay awake." Behind her, the big man crouched down. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd thought, 50s. Maybe, with deep lines carved around his eyes and a scar that split one eyebrow. "Legs broke," he said grimly. "I can see that. We can't ride." Arm took out the road behind us. Tree came down half a mile back. And the road ahead, he looked up into the white chaos, and she watched him do the math and hate the answer. Making it to town. Not in this. Not with him like that. Claire looked at him. 10 men. A blizzard, the radio had said, would kill anyone caught outside. Dying in her arms, she thought of the shelter. Daniel's shelter. Concrete walls. Generator. Blankets. Or a wood stove he'd installed himself. Built for two. For a war that never came. Built, she understood now with a strange calm certainty, the resent for exactly this. "How many of you are there?" she asked. The man hesitated. 10. "There's a shelter." In the shop. She was already sliding her arms under the young rider's shoulders. "Oh, it'll be tight, but it's warm and it's dry and it'll hold. Help me get him up." The big man stared at her. "What?" she snapped. "Is there a problem? You don't know who we are." "I know exactly who you are." She met his eyes without flinching. Something in her voice made the whole huddle go quiet. "You're 10 men freezing to death 6 miles from the nearest help. That's who you are tonight. Now pick up your brother and follow me, or stand here arguing until you all die of stubbornness." For a long moment, the big man didn't move. Very slowly, something changed in his weathered face. Then a smile. The situation was too dire for that. It was something and rougher and harder to name. It was the look of a man who had spent his whole life being treated like a threat, suddenly being treated like a person. "Hawk," he said. "My name is Hawk." He slid his massive arms under the young rider and lifted him like he weighed nothing. "Whatever your name is, lady, I'm going to remember it a long time." "Claire," she said, standing, grabbing her ruined coat. "It's Claire. Now move." Getting 10 grown men through a blizzard and into a shelter built for two is not a thing that happens quietly. They came stumbling in, one after another, ducking their heads through the low door Daniel had cut, dripping ice and blood and cursing under their breath. And every one of them stopped for half a second at the threshold to look at her, this small woman in a soaked flannel shirt, holding the door against a wind that wanted to tear it off its hinges with something like disbelief. And she kept saying, and keep moving. You're letting the heat out. She counted them as they passed. Her city. She couldn't help it. Some old instinct, maybe left over from watching Daniel count tools before he closed the shop every night. 2, 3, 4, carrying Mitch between them. 5, 6, 7. A heavy-set man with a gray ponytail who nodded at her like a soldier. 9. Then Hawk last, filling the doorway. Pulled the door shut behind him and threw the bolt and leaned her whole weight against it. The first time since the alert screamed across her phone, herself breathe. The shelter was chaos. 10 enormous men in a concrete room the size of a large bathroom, pulling off frozen leather, blowing on ruined fingers, laying Mitch out on the cot Daniel had bolted to the wall. The wood stove was already going. She'd lit it an hour ago when she thought she'd be sitting in here alone, and the little space was filling with heat and the smell of wet wool and blood and men. She should have been terrified. She kept waiting to be terrified. Instead, she watched them, and what she saw rearranged something in her chest that had been arranged wrong for a very long time. The heavy-set one, with the ponytail Diesel, they called him, was already tearing a spare shirt into strips to splint Mitch's leg, and his big scarred hands were as gentle as a nurse's. A wiry younger rider called Pope was going man-to-man, fingers for frostbite, murmuring, "You good? Let me see. You good?" A man with a graying red beard had pulled a battered first aid kit from somewhere and was threading a needle by the light of the stove. They were, she realized, taking care of each other. Nobody was shoving to get closest to the fire. Nobody was hoarding the blankets she'd stacked in the corner. Blankets went to Mitch first, and then to the two men whose lips had gone the whitest, and the men who got none simply crossed their arms and said nothing and shivered. Huck had come to stand beside her, ducking under the low ceiling. Up close in the light, she could see he was shaking too. Could see the ice melting in his beard. Could see that this man, who'd carried a 200-pound rider through a blizzard, was running on the last of his own reserves. "Claire, I gotta say something to you." "Say it then." "I've been riding 38 years, he said it quietly. "A confession. There's been in more towns than I can count. Most of them. A woman who saw us coming would have locked her door and called the law and prayed we kept going." He looked at her. His flat, careful eyes weren't flat anymore. "You ran toward us." "My husband," Claire said, and her voice did the thing it always did on that word. "Used to say people are more important than things. He a smart man, the smartest I ever knew." She looked away to the stove, the caught of the young rider fighting for his life on her husband's cot. 3 years now. Hawk was quiet for a moment. "Sorry," he said. And she believed him. That was the thing she'd remember later, lying awake, trying to understand the night. She believed him completely, or passed. Then another. A storm did not let up. If anything, it got worse. Screaming against the concrete, and once something heavy, a branch of a fence she'd never know, struck the shelter door, hard enough to make everyone jump. Walls held. Daniel's walls held. Mitch stabilized. A graying red beard, whose name turned out to be Doc, an actual medic, urged Army 2 tours, got the leg splinted, and got him warm and got some water into him. And around the second hour, the young rider's eyes cleared and he looked around the crowded little room in confusion and said, "Where are we?" "Someplace safe," Doc told him. "There's shelter." "What lady?" And 10 men turned to look at Claire. Her face go hot. She started. "Don't you dare say nobody again," Hawk rumbled. She closed her mouth. Mitch stared at her from the cot. This stranger who'd knelt in the snow and given him her coat, and his young face did something complicated. "You went out in that?" he said. "Us? You were on the ground. People don't," his voice caught. "Don't do that. Not for us." Well, Claire said, and busied herself with the stove so she wouldn't have to look at him. Not people, I'm just a woman with a shelter and a dead husband's advice ringing in my ears. Now drink your water. But she felt them watching her, all of them. And something in the room had shifted so completely that when Diesel, the big man with the ponytail, cleared his throat and said, I don't know your husband, but I'd have shook his hand, she had to turn all the way toward the wall so they wouldn't see her cry. Through the long hours of the storm, 10 men crammed into a bunker built for two, and there was nothing to do but talk, so they talked. And Claire listened, and every word took another brick out of the wall the town had spent her whole life building in her head. Had two little girls back in the next state over. Pulled a wallet photo out of his soaked jacket and showed her, trembling from cold, grinning like a fool. That's Ava. Rose. Rose lost her front tooth last week. Look at that gap. His voice went thick. I was supposed to be home Sunday. I don't even know if... He stopped. He couldn't... Claire finished it for him. You'll be home, she said. Term's gonna pass. You'll be home and Rose is gonna show you that gap in person. So act surprised even though you already saw the picture. Pope laughed. Broke a little. Yeah, he said. Yeah, okay. Diesel had spent 20 years fixing transmissions before his shop closed. He looked around Daniel's garage shelter with a mechanic's eyes and said, whoever built this knew what he was doing. And Claire had to leave the conversation for a minute. Had put 3 men back together in a war he never talked about, another one back together tonight. And when Claire asked him why he did it, why any of them did it, they turned back into the storm for one fallen rider instead of running for their own lives. He looked at her like she'd asked why the sun came up. He's ours, Doc said simply. You don't leave your own in the cold. Whatever. Not for nothing. You don't leave your own in the cold. Claire thought about the town, about the church that had emptied out on her after Daniel died, casseroles that stopped coming after the second month, the neighbors who'd waved from their trucks and never once stopped to ask how she was making it out here alone. What about Marlene, who called on holidays? What about how many nights she'd sat in that dark shop by herself with nobody to talk to but a husband who'd been dead 3 years? You don't leave your own in the cold. The people who were supposed to be her own had left her in the cold a long time ago. Now here she was, warm, in a room full of men her town had taught her to fear, and not one of them had left anybody anywhere. Somewhere in the third hour, the missing man came up. Claire didn't understand it at first. There was a shift in the room. There's tension. Went very still, stopped mid-sentence, and Claire looked around and did the things she'd been doing all night without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, Mitch on the cot. Up, Doc. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9. She said, and her stomach turned to ice. There's Hawk. There's 9 of you. The whole room stopped. There are 10, she said. Out on the road, you said 10. You had 10 coming in. I counted. She was on her feet now, hammering. Where's the 10th? Where's the 10th man? Hawk's face had gone gray. Who's Noah? Prospect. Kid's barely 20. He was already standing, already reaching for his frozen jacket. It was riding drag. Behind us. When Mitch went down, we all stopped, and I thought he shut his eyes. He pulled in with us. I counted. Steady all night, finally cracked. God help me. The men carrying Mitch's too, and I lost track. And I thought, he's still out there, Claire whispered. He said anything. Outside, the wind screamed against the concrete like something alive and starving. Long, Claire said. How long has he been out there? Doc looked at his watch and his medic's face, face that had held steady through a broken leg and a dying boy. He showed her fear. 3 hours, he said. In this. The wind chill. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew what 3 hours in a killing storm meant. Doc was pulling his jacket on. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely find the sleeves. Go back out there, Pope said. Hawk! Hawk! Got it. You go out there, we lose too. He's a kid. Hawk rounded on him and his voice broke the room open. He's 20 years old. He's got a mother who begged me to look out for him. And I left him in the cold. He said the words like they were poison. left him in the cold. The exact thing Doc had sworn they never did. I'm not sitting in here warm while that boy freezes. I'm not. You can hold the door or you can help me. I'm going. And Claire, who had spent 3 years being told to hide, had spent one night learning she'd been lied to about who the dangerous people really were, grabbed a fleshlight off Daniel's shelf and a coil of rope off Daniel's hook and said the last thing anyone in that room expected. We tie off, she said. You don't go out into that without a line back to the door, or we lose all three of you. Daniel kept 50 feet of rope right here for exactly this. One end of that pipe. I'll hold the door and feed you slack. Which direction was he behind you? Hawk stared at her. Every man in that room stared at her. Claire, Hawk said slowly. This ain't your. If you say this isn't my problem, Claire said, I will hit you with this flashlight. He is a 20-year-old boy freezing to death 200 feet from a warm room, and I have the only rope and the only door and the only shelter for 6 miles. Makes it exactly my problem. Now tie off and go find your kid. For one heartbeat, the big man just looked at her, this woman half his size, to the bone, holding out a coil of her dead husband's rope like a lifeline thrown across everything the world had told them both about each other. Took the rope. Diesel, with me, he said, putting the line around his waist with hands that had stopped shaking. Stay with Mitch. Pope, he looked at Claire, helps her hold that door. And if that line goes slack for more than a 10 count, pull us back whether we've got him or not. You hear me? Pull us back. 10 count, Claire said. Understood. Hawk tied the other end of the rope to the pipe Daniel had run along the ceiling, tested it with one savage yank that made the whole shelter groan, and then he looked at the bolted door. And Claire saw him gather himself the way she'd gathered herself an hour before her whole life changed. She said, hand on the bolt. No, Hawk said honestly. Me neither. Go. She threw the bolt and hauled the door open, and the storm came in like a living thing, and 2 enormous men vanished into the white. And Claire Whitmore braced her boots against her dead husband's concrete and held the line. The rope paid out through her hands by frozen foot. Pope was beside her, gripping the door, and the wind was trying to rip it off its hinges. And inside Doc was murmuring to Mitch, and the others had gone dead silent. Claire counted rope and counted seconds and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. 10 feet of line, 20, 30. Come on, she whispered. Come on, 40 feet. That's almost all of it, Pope said, his voice tight. That's almost all the rope. If they don't find him in the next 10 feet, the line went slack. Claire's heart stopped. She started her 10 count out loud. It's the way Hawk told her, and she'd never in her life wanted so badly to be wrong about something. 1, 2, 3, the line snapped taut again so hard it burned through her palms, and a voice screamed out of the Stormhawk's voice, ragged, triumphant, half torn away by the wind. We pull us in, alive, pull. The whole shelter came alive at once. 10 hands on the rope where there'd been 2, leaving Mitch's side. Every man who could stand throwing his weight against the line. Claire pulling until her shoulders screamed, and out of the white nightmare came Hawk and Diesel, staggering, half frozen, dragging a limp shape between them, a boy, flipped, unconscious, barely more than a child. Through the door in a heap, and Pope slammed it and threw the bolt, and Claire dropped to her knees beside the boy called Noah. Hawk. Hawk was shouting. Cock, he's not. I can't tell if Doc was already there, already tearing at the frozen jacket, already pressing 2 fingers to the boy's throat. The whole room held its breath, and the storm howled. And Claire watched a group of the most feared men in the country go absolutely silent with terror over a 20-year-old kid. A pulse, Doc said. It's thready. He's hypothermic. Gotta get him warm now. Blankets. Bodies. Everybody who's warm on him. Claire's stove's already hot, she said, dragging the cot closer, hauling the last of the blankets. Come here. Get his wet clothes off. Diesel, feed the fire. And they moved. Comes as one, 10 men and 1 woman, and they packed that boy in warmth and pressed their own bodies against his to give him what heat they had left. At least so slowly, Claire aged a decade watching the blue faded from Noah's lips. Eyes opened. He looked up at the ring of faces staring down at him, concrete ceiling, fire, at the strange woman he'd never seen. And he said in a small, confused voice, "Am I dead?" And Hawk, huge, terrifying, gray-bearded Hawk, 38 years on the road, in the town would have crossed the street to avoid, put his face in his hands, and wept. Nobody slept much after that. He was alive. That was the miracle they kept coming back to, over and over, like they couldn't quite deplete. There's every so often one of the men would look over at Noah, breathing steady now under a mountain of blankets. And shake his head. Diesel kept the fire fed, kept checking pulses, and Claire sat with her back against Daniel's concrete wall and looked around at the impossible thing her night had become. "You saved him," Hawk said. He'd come to sit beside her, and his voice was wrecked from cold and crying and everything else. Rope, holding that door. "You saved that boy's life, Claire. You saved all of ours. You saved him," Claire said. "There, you went out there. I couldn't have found my way back without that line." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were red. "I've had a lot of people be afraid of me in my life. I've had almost none be kind to me. You did both. You were afraid. But in your face out there, on that road, you were scared to death of us. Helped us anyway." He shook his head slowly. "The bravest thing I ever saw. Being scared and doing it anyway. That's the only kind of brave there is." Claire didn't know what to say to that. She said the true thing. "I've been so alone," she said. Out of her before she could stop it. 3 years of it. Out to a stranger in a bunker at the bottom of a storm. Well, Daniel died. This town, everybody I thought was my own, they left. Left me out here in the cold." She laughed and it broke. "Whatever they told me to be afraid of are the only ones who felt like family in 3 years. But what am I supposed to do with that?" Hawk was quiet for a long time. "Negroni, you keep the ones who came back for you," he said finally. "Oh, doesn't matter what patch they wear or what a town says about them. You keep the ones who ran toward you in the storm." He looked at her. "Turned toward us. So I guess that makes us yours now, whether you like it or not." Claire laughed for real that time, and exhausted. "I don't even know your last name," she said. "You don't need them." Hawk pulled something from his pocket, a small card, stained, with a number scrawled on the back in ballpoint. "You need anything, ever. Any trouble, any time, day or night. This number. Doesn't matter where you are. The book, I know what it is." He pressed it into her hand and closed her frozen fingers around it. "You saved 10 of my brothers tonight, Claire. That's a debt. Where I come from, we do not forget a debt. Not ever." Claire looked down at the card. Number. That was all. It didn't seem like much. But she had no idea, sitting there in the dying storm with a stranger's number in her palm. This small water-stained card would one day bring more than 1,000 riders to her door. She tucked it into her shirt pocket over her heart, and she didn't think about it again for weeks. Toward dawn, the wind finally began to die. Claire felt it before she heard it, the change in pressure, loosening of the constant scream against the walls. The storm was breaking. She'd made it. They'd all made it. 10 men and 1 boy and 1 widow, packed into a bunker built for a war that never came, made it through the night. She should have felt relief. She felt a strange, creeping dread, and she didn't understand it until Hawk stood and said the words that would change the shape of the story she didn't yet know she was living. "Time's passing," he said. "Soon as there's light, we'll see what's left out there." What's left? Claire went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. She'd been so focused on the men, on the boy, on the rope and the door, and keeping everyone alive, that she had not once let herself think about the thing sitting right on the other side of that concrete wall. Her shop, her home, the building Daniel raised with his own 2 hands, the business that was the only thing she had left of him, walls that held 18 years of a marriage and 3 years of grief and every memory she owned. And out there, all night, in the worst storm in 40 years. "Huck," she said slowly, "when you said the road behind you was gone, when you said a tree came down," she swallowed. "How bad? Bad was it really, out there?" Hawk looked at her, and she watched him decide not to lie to her. "Bad," he said quietly. "Bad, Claire. I've never seen wind like that. It was taking down full-grown trees like they were nothing. He held her gaze. Shops on the other side of this wall. Solid concrete. Older. But he stopped. The shops just wood, Claire finished. Voice came out very small. Neither of them said anything. The first gray light was coming under the door now, a thin line of dawn. The storm was over. And Claire Whitmore sat with her back against her dead husband's wall, holding a stranger's phone number over her heart, and understood that when she opened that door and stepped out into the morning, she was going to find out exactly what her one act of kindness had cost her. About the shelter Daniel built. Better a bunker we never need than a night we wish we had one. About the 10 men who were alive because of it. About the boy who'd asked if he was dead, and the way Hawk had wept, and Pope's daughter with the missing tooth, and Doc saying, "You don't leave your own in the cold." Claire Whitmore made herself a promise, right there in the gray dawn, before she'd even seen the wreckage waiting for her. Whatever it cost, whatever was out there, whatever she'd lost, she would not be sorry. Remember, she got to her feet. Her legs were stiff. Her hands were raw from the rope. To the door, and Hawk rose to follow her. Behind him, 9 other men and 1 boy went quiet. Then the woman who'd saved them square her shoulders to face whatever the night had done to the only thing she had left. Claire's hand closed on the bolt. It was the same hand that had reached for the light switch 12 hours before the hand that was supposed to lock the shop and hide her away and keep her safe and small and alone. About how close she'd come to turning that switch off. Close she'd come to sitting in the dark while 10 men and a boy died 200 feet from a warm room. Close she'd come to being exactly the person the town had raised her to be. Claire, people are more important than things, Claire. Everything else is just weather. "Hi, Daniel," she whispered, and she threw the bolt, opened the door, and stepped out into the light of the morning after, into the wreckage, into the ruin, into the beginning of everything that was about to come for her. Under 10 men and a boy she'd saved rose to their feet as one, followed her out into the cold. The door swung wide. Whitmore stepped out into a morning that took the breath right out of her. For a moment, she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Her mind kept reaching for the shape of the building that was supposed to be there, the long, low roof line. There are 2 big bay doors. The hand-painted sign Daniel had lettered himself on a Sunday afternoon 11 years ago while she held the ladder and complained he was getting paint in his hair. None of it was there. Where Whitmore Auto Repair had stood, there's a heap, a broken spine of splintered wood and twisted metal and shattered glass, buried in snow, steaming faintly in the cold. The roof had come down. 2 walls had gone with it. Narrow-grown oak, the one Daniel used to park his truck under in the summer, lay across the middle of it all like something a giant had thrown. Claire didn't scream. That was the strange thing she'd have thought a person would scream. But she just stopped walking and stood very still. Cold got into her all at once. Claire. Hawk was beside her. She heard him say her name, but it seemed to come from very far away. "I'm so sorry." "That's the shop," she said. Her voice sounded odd to her own ears, flat and small. "That was Daniel built that. He built the whole thing. He her post right there. That himself watched him do it. He was so proud." She pointed at a shattered beam sticking up out of the wreckage like a broken bone. "That was the office. My desk is under there. All the paperwork, the photos. We had photos on that wall. Claire, there were photos on that wall." She turned to look at him, and her face had gone white. "Their wedding. Daniel's dad. The day we opened, I had a picture of him on that wall from the last good day, before he got sick. And it was on that wall, and now it's..." She stopped. She pressed both hands over her mouth, behind them. They had come out one by one, and they stood in a rough half circle, staring at the ruin. And not one of them said a word, because they understood. Every one of them understood what it meant to lose the thing you built. Every one of them understood the arithmetic that Claire hadn't let herself do yet, arithmetic that was sitting there in the wreckage, plain as day. They were alive because she'd taken them in, and her whole world was gone because she'd stayed to do it. "Open that door," Diesel said quietly. Big Diesel, Tail, and the gentle hands you'd have been in there. Remember, when the roof came down, you'd have been sitting in that office, that you. Claire didn't answer. She didn't have to, because it was true, and everyone knew it was true. That was exactly where she'd have been. She'd been about to lock the shop and wait out the storm in the office. There, she heard the engines. If she'd never heard them, if she'd flipped that switch, sat down at her desk under those photographs, she'd be dead right now. Hushed under the roof of the only thing she had left. It had cost her everything. And the men had saved her life. She stood in the snow trying to hold both of those things at once. And she found she couldn't. And something in her chest just broke open. And she started to cry, not pretty crying, not movie crying, full heaving kind. 3 years of it, the shop and Daniel and the loneliness and the terror of the night all coming up at once. Who did not seem like a man who hugged people, one enormous arm around her shoulders and stood there and let her fall apart against his ruined leather jacket. And none of the other men looked away. And none of them said the thing people always said, they're going to be okay. It's just a building. It can be rebuilt. They just stood with her in the cold and let it be as bad as it actually was. By the time the sun was fully up, the road had cleared enough that the first trucks came through. Claire heard them before she saw them. And part of her, the part that had spent 3 years alone out here, actually lifted a little at the sound. Because those were town trucks. Those were her neighbors coming to check on the folks out on the highway after the worst storm in 40 years. Well, that's what a town did. That's what she'd been raised to believe a town did. First truck slowed as it came around the bend. Recognized it Gus Pruitt, who ran the feed store, a man she'd known her whole life, a man who'd been at Daniel's funeral. His truck slowed, and Claire lifted her hand to wave, ready to be found, ready to be helped, and then Gus saw the motorcycles, their bikes, scattered and snow-covered, and dropped where their riders had abandoned them the night before. And 10 enormous men in Hell's Angels, colors standing in the wreckage of the Whitmore place. Claire watched Gus Pruitt's face change through the windshield, watched the wave die on her own, lifted hand, watched a man she'd known for 40 years take his foot off the brake and speed up and drive right past her without stopping. Yes, she said quietly to no one. Gus, it's me. He was already gone. That truck did the same. And the third. Word must have already gone around town, a woman alone, 6 miles out, and a pack of Hell's Angels in her yard the morning after the storm. They didn't slow down to help. They slowed down to look. And then they drove on, and Claire stood in the ruin of her life and watched her own people leave her in the cold for the second time in 3 years. And this time she understood exactly what she was watching. "They'll be conch with you," Pope said. He'd come up beside her. His voice was flat, with an old, familiar bitterness. "They see us, they see the patches, and they figure you're a hostage or you're already dead or you're..." He stopped. "They ain't coming to help, Claire. Not while we're standing here. We're the reason nobody's stopping." That's Claire started. As though Pope wasn't angry at her. He was just tired of a man who'd seen this exact thing 100 times. "Oh, get the bikes running. Get gone. We're making it worse for you just by being here. I get help faster if we're not standing in your yard." And Claire heard the reasonable sound of it. Claire heard the logic. They were the reason her neighbors wouldn't stop. If they left, the trucks would come back, and Gus Pruitt would help her dig through the wreckage. Town would remember it loved her, and everything would go back to the shape it was supposed to be. She looked at the road where Gus's truck had disappeared. She looked at the 10 men who'd sat up all night keeping a boy alive. Whitmore made a decision that surprised even her. She said. Pope blinked. "No, you're not going anywhere until Noah can ride." She wiped her face with the back of her raw hand, and something hard came into it, something that had been missing for 3 years. "That boy nearly died last night. He is not getting back on a motorcycle 6 hours later because Gus Pruitt is too much of a coward to stop his truck when it's safe to leave, and not 1 minute before." She turned to face the whole group of them. "And if my neighbors won't stop to help me because you're standing here, then I guess I'm finding out what my neighbors are really worth." Sure. Which is something I probably needed to find out anyway. Hawk looked at her for a long moment. Understand what you're saying, he said slowly. Let us here, this town's going to remember it. You keep us. You're going to have to live here after we're gone. They'll say you took up with us. They'll say things about you. They're ugly things. And you'll be out here alone when they say them. I've been alone out here for 3 years. Fuck. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. That time, not one of those trucks stopped to see if I was making it. You people crashed into my life 12 hours ago, and you've already done more for me than this whole town did in 3 years. She lifted her chin, so they can say what they want. I know who came back for me and who drove past. All I need to know about anybody. For a second, nobody moved. And Diesel said quietly, none in particular. Oh, hell. And there was something in his voice that sounded almost like it hurt. They stayed all that day, and watched, and the trucks kept driving past. Claire didn't care. The men worked. Nobody told them to. They just started working hauling the fallen oak off the wreckage a limb at a time, pulling out what could be saved, laying it in careful piles in the snow. Found her toolboxes, half crushed but salvageable, and dug them out with his bare hands. Doc found a strong box in the ruins of the office and set it aside for her without opening it. Claire finally worked up the nerve to go digging through the crushed office herself, looking for the photographs. It was young Mitch legs splinted, hobbling on a crutch. Doc had rigged from a 2x4, who saw her searching and understood what she was searching for. What do they look like? He asked. The pictures. I know what I'm looking for. You've got a broken leg, Claire said. I can dig sitting down. He lowered himself into the snow beside the wrecked office wall and started going through the debris with his hands. Oh, careful, setting aside anything with paper on it. Tell me what they look like. And Claire, who had told herself for 3 years that she didn't need anybody, she could do everything alone, that asking for help was the same as being weak, knelt down in the snow beside a 25-year-old biker with a broken leg and helped him look for pictures of a dead man, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like she wasn't alone. They found 4 of the photographs. The wedding picture was gone. The glass had shattered, and the water had ruined it beyond saving. Claire held the sodden ruin of it for a long moment and then set it down. They found the one of Daniel and his father, and they found the one from opening day. And they found Mitch found it and went very still, and then held it out to her without a word, the one of Daniel on the last good day before the diagnosis. Or maybe standing in the doorway of his shop with his arms crossed and that crooked grin turning into the sun. Is this him? Mitch asked. Claire took it. The frame was cracked, but the picture was whole. Grinning, alive, standing in the door of the thing he'd built. That's him, she said. Mitch was quiet. Then he said, like a guy who'd have opened the door too. And Claire had to walk away for a minute, past the wreckage where they couldn't see her, immersed in the snow, and hold that picture against her chest and let the tears come, because it was the truest and kindest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years, and had come from a boy her whole town would have told her to fear. Well, the men left the next morning when Noah could ride. It wasn't easy. Nobody said it out loud. But the leaving was hard on all of them. And Claire realized with a small shock that it was hard on her most of all. 5 hours ago, these had been the men she'd been afraid of her entire life. Others come. Now she stood in her ruined yard, watching them wheel their bikes out to the road, and she felt like she was watching family drive away. Her pale, shaky, wrapped in one of her blankets he refused to give back, came to her last. He was so young, younger even than Mitch, and he didn't know how to say what he wanted to say, so he just stood there for a second, and then he stepped forward and hugged her hard, the way a kid hugs. You held the door, he said into her shoulder. Doc told me, when they went out to get me, you held the door and you had the rope, and if you hadn't, he pulled back. Eyes were wet. I've got a mom, he said, back home. When I tell her, he couldn't finish. You tell her, Claire said, putting his face in her raw hands, that a woman out on a cold highway is real glad she got to keep her son. Or that. Noah nodded and couldn't speak. No way. And then it was Hawk. He stood in front of her, huge and awkward, And for a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then he reached out and took her hand carefully, like it might break, and turned it over and looked at the rope burns still raw across her palm. You still got that number I gave you? He asked. In my pocket, she patted her shirt. You call it. He wasn't asking. This town's going to give you trouble now. I've seen it 100 times. Once folks decide a thing about you, unlearn it easy, and they've already decided you're one of ours. He held her gaze. But when it gets hard, and it's gonna get hard, Claire, harder than you think, you call that number. Doesn't matter the reason. Doesn't matter the hour. You call it and you tell him, Hawk said to answer. Hawk. She squeezed his hand. I'm okay. I've got the insurance, it's a mess, but it's just paperwork. I'll rebuild. I don't need to bother you people over some insurance forms. Hawk looked at her for a long moment. You don't get it yet, he said quietly. I will. He let go of her hand. You saved 10 of us. There's no insurance form in the world worth more than that. Oh, promise me you'll call. I promise, Claire said. And meant it the way you mean a thing you're sure you'll never have to do. And then they were gone. 10 bikes, one after another, pulling out onto the highway. Engines rough and loud in the cold morning. Claire stood alone in the ruin of her life and listened to the sound of them fade. And it took a very long time to fade. And when it finally did, the silence that came after was the loneliest thing she'd ever heard. She went inside the shelter, the only room she had left, and she sat down on Daniel's cot, the water tank card on the little shelf where she'd remember it, and she started alone to figure out how she was going to put her whole life back together. She had no idea she was already being watched by someone who did not want her to rebuild at all. The insurance man came on a Tuesday. Claire had spent 9 days by then living in the shelter, running the little generator, digging through the wreckage by day, filling out forms by night. Her sister Marlene had finally called. I heard about the bikers. Claire, the whole town's talking. What were you thinking? And Claire had let the phone ring out. Phone's talking. Of course it was. But the insurance man was polite. That was the first thing that put her on edge, though she couldn't have said why at the time. All right. He was too polite. His name was Rennick, and he had a soft handshake and a soft voice and a clipboard, and he walked through the wreckage of her life saying, and I see, and well now, and writing things down. And at the end of an hour, he stood in front of her and gave her a small, professional smile. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be complicated. Complicated how, Claire said. Things gone. A tree fell on it in a storm. The policy for 11 years, and I've never missed a payment. Of course, Rennick nodded, all sympathy. It's just the nature of the damage. You see, there's some question about the cause. Storm damage is covered, absolutely. But if the structural failure was due to, say, pre-existing deterioration, improper maintenance, or if the tree that fell was on your property and inadequately maintained, it was an oak tree. Mr. Rennick, Claire stared at him in a 40-year storm. What was I supposed to do? Hold it up. I'm just explaining the process. His smile never wavered. We'll need to send out an engineer. There'll be an assessment. These things take time. I want to set realistic expectations. This could be, months, possibly longer. And there's a chance, I have to be honest with you, Lakeland could be denied entirely if the assessment finds denied. Claire's stomach dropped. You can't deny it. I did everything right. I have the policy. Nothing's decided. Mrs. Whitmore. He was already gathering his clipboard. Let's just see what the assessment finds. I'll be in touch. And he stood in the wreckage with the taste of something wrong in her mouth, though she couldn't yet name what it was. She named it 11 days later when the letter from the bank arrived. The bank letter was worse than the insurance man because the bank letter had teeth. Claire read it 3 times before she believed it. Mortgage on the property, the mortgage Daniel had taken out to expand the shop, mortgage they'd been paying down steadily for years, had a clause. It was about the property maintaining operational status. A clause that Claire had signed 11 years ago without reading, because Daniel had said it was fine and she'd trusted Daniel. The shop was destroyed and not operational. And was informing her that in the Under the terms of the note, they were entitled to demand payment in full. Payment in full. A destroyed building, with an insurance claim frozen. The bank. She got a man named Fenley, who was even softer and even sorrier than the insurance man, and who told her, in a voice dripping with false regret, that the bank's hands were tied, that the note was the note. If she could secure the insurance payout, the whole thing would resolve itself. Until then, well, there were deadlines, there were procedures. Closure was a possibility she should prepare herself for. Foreclosure, Claire repeated. She was gripping the edge of Daniel's cot so hard her knuckles were white. To foreclose on a woman whose building just got destroyed in a natural disaster. Now, wants that outcome, Mrs. Whitmore. Then don't do it. But the bank does have to protect its interests. Others, Lily added, and here his voice changed, just slightly, just enough for Claire to hear a new note come into it. If you were interested in selling the property, that would resolve the debt cleanly. In fact, I understand there's a buyer already interested in that parcel. Developer, very reputable. He's been asking about storm-affected properties in the area. I'd put you in touch. It might be the simplest way out of this whole mess. Claire went very still. Developer, she said slowly, asking about storm-affected properties. Already interested in my land. 11 days after the storm. He's very reputable. What's his name? A pause. Hale, Fenley said. Hale. Victor Hale came to see her himself. He came in a black car that didn't belong on a highway 6 miles out of town. Out of it, in a coat that cost more than Claire's whole insurance claim, walked across her ruined yard, picking his way carefully around the debris, like a man who didn't want to dirty his shoes, and he gave her a smile that had every tooth in it and not 1 ounce of warmth. Mrs. Whitmore, he extended a manicured hand. Victor Hale, I am so terribly sorry for what you've been through. This is a tragedy, truly. Claire didn't take the hand. Paul withdrew it smoothly, not the least bit bothered. Get right to it then. I like a woman who doesn't waste time. He looked around at the wreckage. Claire watched him look, and she saw something in his eyes that turned her cold. He wasn't looking at ruin, looking at opportunity. He was looking at her dead husband's life's work and seeing dollar signs. Understand you're in a difficult position. Insurance dragging its feet, breathing down your neck. It's a shame. It happens to good people all the time after a storm like this. The system just grinds them up. He shook his head with false sorrow. I'd like to help. I'm prepared to make you an offer for the property. Hush, quick, close. You'd walk away free and clear. No more bank, no more insurance headaches, no more freezing out here in a bunker like some refugee. Start fresh. Somewhere warm, somewhere easy. How much? Claire said. Well, Hale named a number. It was, Claire realized, roughly a fifth of what the property was worth. Maybe less. It was an insult wearing a suit. That's a fraction of what this land is worth, she said. Sure, you know that. You know exactly what it's worth. That's why you're here. Hale's smile didn't move. It's worth now, Mrs. Whitmore. In its current condition, a frozen insurance claim and a bank about to foreclose. To be realistic about your situation. A property is only worth what someone will pay for it. And right now, he spread his hands. I'm the only one offering to pay anything at all. Get off my land, Mrs. Whitmore, you heard me. Claire's voice was shaking. Not with fear. You come out here 11 days after I lose everything. You've already got the bank calling me about you before I even knew your name. Offer me a fifth of what my husband's life is worth and call it help. She stepped toward something in her face made the smooth, confident man take an involuntary step back. I know what you are. I've known men like you my whole life. You're a buzzard. You wait for the storm and then you pick the bones. You can pick somebody else's. This is Daniel Whitmore's land. I'm his wife, and I would rather burn it to the ground myself than sell it to you for a nickel. Get in your car and get off my property before I make you. For just a moment, the mask slipped, just for a moment. But Claire saw it. The smile drop and the eyes go flat and cold and reptilian. And she saw the real Victor Hale look out at her, and the real Victor Hale was not sorry, and the real Victor Hale was not kind. And the real Victor Hale was a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted and did not take kindly to being told no by a widow standing in the wreckage of her own life. "Sir, you're making a mistake," he said, and the softness was gone from his voice now, us, replaced by something quiet and hard. "I'm offering you a way out. You won't get another. That bank is going to foreclose, Mrs. Whitmore, and that insurance company is going to deny your claim. When they do, this land goes to auction, and I'll buy it at auction for half what I'm offering you now. The difference is whether you walk away with something in your pocket or walk away with nothing." He straightened his expensive coat. "Always get the land I want. Always. The only choice you have is how much it costs you to fight me." He gave her one last look. "Boots. Think about it. My offer's good for 1 week." And he got in his black car and drove away. And Claire stood in the wreckage of Daniel's life and understood, really, all at once, what had been happening to her. The insurance man, the bank, the developer. It wasn't 3 separate strokes of bad luck. Her plan, one machine. And the machine was pointed at her. That bank is going to foreclose. That insurance company is going to deny your claim. He'd said it like he knew, because he did know, because he was making it happen. Claire's hand went to her shirt pocket where a water-stained card had sat for weeks. Then she stopped. "I've been so alone," she told Hawk in the shelter, but Aaron just left. And Hawk had told her to call. Made her promise to call, and she'd promised sure she'd never have to. Now, standing here, with the machine closing in on her, the old voice came back, the voice that had run her life for 3 years. "Oh, you've already asked too much of strangers. They saved your life, and you cost them nothing, but you can't keep going back to that well. This is your fight. Daniel's land, but you handle it yourself. You don't drag those men into your mess. You've taken enough." Claire's hand fell away from the card. "I can handle this," she said out loud. To the empty yard, to the wreckage, to a dead man who couldn't answer. "I don't need to call anybody. I can handle this myself." It was the worst decision she would make in the whole long fight. And she made it, alone, in the cold, with the only lifeline she had sitting untouched in her pocket over her heart. She tried to handle it herself. She tried. She spent the next 2 weeks fighting the machine with the only weapons she had: paperwork, calls, and stubbornness. She called the insurance company every single day. Rennick. Or she got someone who wasn't Rennick and knew nothing. Or she got a hold line that played the same 11 seconds of music for 40 minutes before disconnecting her. She learned the shape of being handled. Every call ended with someone soft and sorry telling her the assessment was pending. The engineer was scheduled. The claim was under review. Please be patient. These things take time. The bank was worse. The bank had dates. The bank sent another letter, and then another, each one a little colder than the last, each one moving the machinery a little further along. Foreclosure proceedings would commence. A notice would be filed. A period of cure would be provided. 30 days, 20. And then the number kept getting smaller, and Claire kept calling and kept getting friendly and kept hearing about the reputable developer who could make it all go away. And then the permits. Claire had thought, in whatever small hopeful part of her still worked, that she could at least start rebuilding, that she could clear the wreckage and pour a foundation and put up walls with her own 2 hands if she had to. Worry about the money later, because a working shop was worth more than a pile of rubble and might even shame the insurance company into paying. She went down to the county office to pull the building permits. She was denied. Properties under review. The clerk told her, meeting her eyes, can't issue permits on a property with an active foreclosure notice and a pending insurance dispute. Flagged. Flagged by who? The clerk shuffled papers. Just flagged, ma'am. I don't make the rules. Who flagged it? I really can't. Was it Hale? Claire leaned across the counter. Other Hale. Did he flag my property? The clerk's face told her everything. The clerk's face went pale and careful and shut, and the clerk said, very quietly, I think you should talk to a lawyer. There's, ma'am. And Claire understood that the machine had reached all the way into the county building, too. There was nowhere she could go in this whole county that Victor Hale hadn't already been. She drove home. She sat in the shelter. She looked at the water-stained card on the shelf. And she still didn't call, because now there was something else stopping her, worse than pride. Now there was shame, because she was losing. Because everything Hale had promised was coming true, exactly as he'd said it, and she'd told those men she was fine, told Hawk she could handle it, and she couldn't. She was drowning, and to call now felt like calling to say you were right. Couldn't do it. I'm exactly as helpless as everyone always thought. Here, and Claire Whitmore, who had held a door against a blizzard, not make herself pick up a phone and say she was helpless. So she didn't, and the machine kept grinding. She found the other victims by accident. It was Doris Halloran, who tipped her off old Doris, who ran the diner in town, one of the few people who hadn't turned her back after the bike, mostly because Doris didn't care what anybody thought about anything. They had gone in for coffee. Unable to stand the shelter one more hour, Doris had leaned over the counter and said, "Look, you're not the only one, you know. Not the only one, what? Storm folks are losing their places." Doris glanced around the empty diner and lowered her voice further. "The Petersons out on County Road 9. Their barn came down, insurance stalled them out, bank came calling, and next thing you know, some slick developers offering pennies. Old. Couldn't fight it. And the Kowalskis, same thing. Ours. And that young couple with the greenhouse operation, what's their name they sold to? All of them storm hit. All of them stalled by the same insurance outfit. All of them bought up cheap by the same man." Doris looked at her hard. "Now who does that remind you of, honey?" Claire set down her coffee. Her hands weren't quite steady. "How many?" she said. "Have? 5, 6, counting you." Doris shook her head. "I'd bet there's more. He's been doing this quiet, playing up half the storm-hit land in the county for a song, and everybody's too beat down to say anything. They just take the money and go." She fixed Claire with a look. "You didn't take the money, did you?" "You told him no." "I told him no." "Good." Doris refilled her cup without being asked. "He oughta. Man's a vulture. But you be careful. Claire Whitmore. Vultures don't like being told no. Out there all alone. All alone." Claire drove home with those words ringing in her ears. The whole picture assembled itself in her mind on the dark highway. Ugly and complete. It wasn't just her, it was a pattern. It was a scheme. Hale had the insurance company, or somebody in it Rennick. Light man stalling and denying claims. He had the bank, or somebody in it, moving to foreclose the second a property went dark. He had the county flagging permits so nobody could rebuild. And into that engineered helplessness he came, the reasonable man with the cash offer, up the wreckage of people's lives for pennies while they were too crushed and too alone to fight. Claire was the one who'd said no, which meant Claire was the one he had to break. Home. She parked. She walked into the shelter and she sat down on Daniel's cot in the dark, and for a long time she didn't move. She had 11 days left before the foreclosure deadline. The insurance claim was frozen and about to be denied. Payments were blocked. She had no lawyer she could afford. And even if she could, Doris had made it plain everyone who'd fought had lost. He had money and lawyers and reach, and he had the insurance company and the bank and the county in his pocket all the time in the world. And Claire had nothing. A ruined shop and a dead husband's shelter and a stubborn refusal to sell. None of it was going to be enough. And she knew it now. And sitting in the dark, she was going to lose Daniel's land. After everything, after the storm and the shelter, and holding the door and building a whole life out here, she was going to lose it to a man in an expensive coat who bought grief for pennies. Less. Claire's eyes went to the shelf. The card was still there. Stained, curling now at the edges, a phone number in fading ballpoint. It doesn't matter the reason, doesn't matter the hour. Huck's voice in the dying storm. "You saved 10 of my brothers. The debt. And where I come from, we do not forget a debt. Ever, she'd promised. He'd promised she'd call. And she'd spent weeks breaking that promise out of pride, out of shame, out of a lifetime of being told she should be able to do everything alone, while the machine ground her down to nothing, exactly the way Hale had promised it would. Claire looked at the card for a very long time. Outside, the highway was dark and empty, the way it had been the night the engines came. About that night, she thought about a boring boy on the ground who didn't get up. Every instinct had told her to lock the door and hide. How she'd run out in the storm anyway, because a dead man's voice told her people mattered more than things. She'd been brave once, braver than she'd ever known she could be. The bravest thing she'd done that night wasn't holding the door. It was letting herself need somebody. Claire stood up. Her legs were shaking. She crossed the little shelter, Daniel's shelter, that had saved 10 lives, and she reached up and took the water-stained card off the shelf and held it in her raw, hard hand, and she looked at the number until the digits swam. 11 days. That was all she had left. 11 days before a man in an expensive coat took the last thing her husband ever built and turned it into a parking lot or a strip mall or whatever a vulture built on the bones of the things it picked clean. She had one phone call left in the world that might matter. Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She picked up the phone off the cot. Her daughters, and with a hand that would not stop trembling in the dark, Bate, alone with everything she had left in the world hanging on it, held the number on the card. It rang once. It rang twice. Then a voice she didn't recognize, rough, low. Her instantly alert answered on the third ring and said 4 words that stopped Claire Whitmore's heart cold in her chest. Claire Whitmore, you're alive. You're alive, the voice said again. And there was something in it, relief, disbelief, a rough edge of feeling that a stranger's voice had no business carrying. God. Okay, hold on, don't hang up. I'm gonna want Hawk, the voice was shouting now. Away from the phone. Hawk, it's her. It's the Whitmore woman. Hold. Claire's hand was shaking so hard she nearly dropped the phone. I'm sorry, who is this? Name's Cutter. You don't know me. Lady, you don't understand. He stopped himself. On. He's coming. There was a scramble on the other end, a scrape, a muffled voice, and then a sound Claire knew, a voice she'd know anywhere now, low and graveled and steady as a mountain. Claire. And just like that, hearing him say her name, her weeks of holding herself together alone in the dark came apart. Claire Whitmore sat down hard on Daniel's cot and started to cry. Fuck, she managed. Fuck, I'm sorry. I didn't want to call. I told myself I could handle it. I told myself I'd already asked too much of you people and I couldn't stop. His voice wasn't hard. It was gentle, and that made it worse, made the crying come harder. That right now. You listened to me. You didn't ask us for one thing that night. You gave everything. So you calling me now, this ain't you asking too much. I mean, this is you finally letting me pay a debt I've been sick over for 3 weeks. A pause. Tell me what's wrong. And don't leave anything out. So she told him. She told him all of it, sitting in the dark, the words tumbling out of her in a rush now that the dam had broken. The insurance man who was too polite, the bank and its clause and its deadlines, limits, flag blocked, and Victor hailed the black car, the expensive coat, the fifth of what the land was worth, mask slipping to show the reptile underneath. I always get the land I want, always. She told Hawk what Doris had said about the Petersons and the Kowalskis and all the others. Term hit and stalled out and bought up cheap. She told him it was a scheme, a machine, and it was pointed at her, and she had 11 days. Hawks was silent through all of it. She could hear him breathing. She could hear in the background their voices, men's voices, quiet, listening. When she finished, there was a long pause. Hawks said very quietly, 11 days. 11 days, Claire whispered. And this man, Hale. Something had changed in Hawk's voice. And flat and cold, the voice of a man doing arithmetic she couldn't see. There's he to your land, stood in your yard, looked at you standing in the wreckage of your husband's life, offered you pennies, and when you told him no, he threatened you. He said I was making a mistake. He said the bank would foreclose and the insurance would deny me and he'd buy it at auction for half. He said, her voice caught. He said the only choice I had was how much it cost me to fight him. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete and so long that Claire thought the call had dropped. Huck, I'm here. A breath. I'm going to tell you something now, Claire, and I need you to hear me. You still with me? I'm here. You've spent 3 weeks fighting this alone because you thought you were being strong. Because you thought calling us was weakness. His voice was thick. I want you to understand what you actually did. You had one card, one phone number, one lifeline, and you had a whole army standing behind it, sat on it for 3 weeks while a rich man tried to grind you into the dirt because you didn't want to be a burden. He let that sit. You are not a burden. You are the reason 10 men are alive to answer this phone. Hear me? You are not a burden. You never were. And you are done fighting this alone. Starting right now. Claire pressed her hand over her mouth. Claire, now here's what's going to happen. Went on, and his voice shifted. Claire Brisk went into a register that told her this was a man used to being obeyed. They're going to sell. Not a nickel, not an inch. You hear me? No matter what letter comes, no matter what deadline, no matter who shows up in a suit, you do not sign anything. Me first. Every time. Hawk, the deadline, 11 days is plenty. Plenty for what? And Hawk said the words that would change everything. You saved 10 of my brothers, he said. You think we were just going to send a card? There was steel in it now. Underneath the steel, something almost like a smile. Claire, we've known about you for 3 weeks. You think Noah went home and didn't tell his mother? You think this story didn't travel? Every chapter in 4 states knows the name Claire Whitmore. You're already famous in places you've never been. Men you've never met. You just didn't know it because you were too busy being alone. A pause. It ends now. You hold your ground for 11 days. You don't sign anything. You keep that man off your land. And you let us do the rest. The rest of what, Hawk? Claire's heart was pounding. What are you going to do? We're going to find out who Victor Hale really is, Hawk said quietly. And then we're going to come see you. They started that night. Claire didn't know it yet. She wouldn't understand the scale of it for days, but the moment she hung up the phone, a machine of an entirely different kind woke up and began to move. Because what Victor Hale had never understood, what men like Hale never understood, he'd been taught to fear as a pack of criminals was, among other things, a network that stretched across state lines, a network full of men who'd worked every kind of job. There was mechanics and truckers and welders, also a bail bondsman in one chapter, a retired cop in another, illegal, an accountant, a man who'd spent 15 years in title insurance before the bikes called him home. Ordinary men with ordinary skills and a debt to pay. First call came the next morning. Claire Whitmore? A woman's voice this time, was crisp and professional. My name's Sandra. Hawk asked me to reach out. I do paralegal work down in the city, and I understand you've got a bank trying to foreclose on you with a real ugly little clause. All right? Yes, that's right. But I can't afford. Did I say anything about money? Sandra's voice was dry. You saved my nephew's life in a blizzard, Mrs. Whitmore. As my sister's boy. So you're not going to pay me a dime. You're going to stop apologizing, and you're going to email me a picture of every single document that bank has sent you. I'm going to go to work. That clause they're leaning on? I've seen it before. It's aggressive, and half the time it doesn't hold up when somebody actually pushes back. On people not pushing back. A pause. You're going to push back. Claire sat down. How's your nephew? She said faintly. He is. And he came home and told the whole family about a woman who held a door open in a killing storm so Hawk could drag him in out of the cold. Sandra's crisp voice wavered. Just slightly. My sister hasn't stopped talking about you for 3 weeks. Oh, Mrs. Whitmore, anything. Now send me those documents. The second call came an hour later. A man named Rooster, who'd spent 11 years in the title insurance business before he got smart and quit, who wanted to know everything about Rennick, flight adjuster, and the insurance company he worked for. Third call was a retired sheriff's deputy named Boone. There's 2 states over who wanted to know the exact name of Hale's development company. Got very quiet when Claire told him, and then said, well, now, isn't that interesting, and wouldn't explain what he meant. By the end of the first, Claire had spoken to more members of the Hells Angels than she could count, and not one of them had asked her for anything. And every one of them had said some version of the same thing. You saved our brothers. This is what we do. You're not alone anymore. And piece by piece, the picture of Victor Hale began to come apart. It was Rooster who found the first thread, and once he pulled it, the whole thing started to unravel. Your adjuster, he told Claire over the phone 6 days in. Rennick. I made some calls. Turns out Mr. Rennick doesn't just work for your insurance company, a consulting arrangement on the side. Guess who with? Claire's mouth went dry. Hale LLC, paid consultant, been on the books 18 months. Rooster's voice was grim and satisfied. That alone's a conflict of interest that'd get him fired, and probably sued. It gets better, because when I started looking at which claims, Rennick's been assigned to every single storm claim on a property Hale later bought. Everyone. The man wasn't randomly assigned to your case. He was put there to stall it, to deny it, open you up for the offer. A pause. This isn't a coincidence anymore. There's a paper trail, and Boone, the retired deputy, and the rest of it. Your developer's been busy, he told her. Day 8. And not just in your county. I've been making calls to old friends in 3 states, and Victor Hale's got a pattern going back years. Same play every time. Their disaster hits flood, fire, tornado, don't matter, and Hale swoops in on the wreckage. Adjusters in his pocket to stall the claims, a relationship with a couple of banks to move the foreclosures fast, put up the ruined land for pennies, while folks are too beat down to fight. Boone's voice hardened. In county down south, a man fought him. Older fella, wouldn't sell, kept making noise. And that man's barn caught fire one night. Insurance called it an accident. A long pause. I'm not saying Hale said it. I'm saying the pattern's ugly, and there's people scared to talk. There's this much smoke, Claire. There is fire. Sometimes literally, Claire gripped the phone. So what do we do with this? Knowing it isn't the same as stopping it. He's got money, lawyers. He's got the bank and the insurance and the county all in his pocket. He's a crook. Doesn't give me back my 11 days. No, Boone agreed. It gives us something better than 11 days. It gives us leverage. And it gives us this. He paused. There's a woman named Delgado, investigative reporter, works for a paper 2 counties over, been trying to pin something on Hale for a year and never had enough to run with. Had a victim willing to go on the record, never had the paper trail, but never had anybody brave enough to stand up and say his name out loud. Another pause. There? You willing to say his name out loud, Claire? Claire thought about Daniel, the shop he built, about standing in the wreckage while her neighbors drove past. A man in an expensive coat telling her the only choice she had was how much it cost her to fight. Yes, she said. I'll say his name as loud as you want. Hale found out she was fighting on day 9. She knew he'd found out because the pressure changed. Being polite, the bank sent a courier, an actual courier, property 6 miles out on the highway, with a letter moving the foreclosure timeline up. The insurance company's daily runaround got a new flavor. The claim wasn't just pending, it was flagged for potential fraud investigation, which Sandra told her was a naked intimidation tactic, a way of turning Claire from victim into suspect. And a county inspector showed up, unannounced, and spent 2 hours crawling over her wreckage, looking for code violations, citations, anything, some new lever to pull. And then Hale himself called. Remembers Mrs. Whitmore. The soft voice was back, but the softness had a blade in it now. I hear you've been busy. Making friends? Asking questions. A pause. I have to say I'm disappointed. I came to you in good faith, offered you a way out, and instead of taking it, you've decided to be difficult, and you've dragged some very unsavory characters into your business. The blade came out fully, and you're so proud of, Mrs. Whitmore. Those bikers, do you have any idea what people say about them? Understand what it does to a woman's reputation out here alone, to have it known she's mixed up with a motorcycle gang, trying to help you, and you're throwing it away, and you're doing it with the help of criminals. Claire's hand tightened on the phone. That again, she said quietly. I said, you called them criminals. Her voice was shaking. With fear anymore, with fury. Those criminals held a door open in a blizzard, so a 20-year-old boy wouldn't freeze to death 200 feet from a warm room. Those criminals dug through the wreckage of my husband's life on their hands and knees to find me 4 photographs. Those criminals haven't asked me for one single thing except to let them help me, which is more than my own church did, more than my own neighbors did, more than anybody in this county did except them. She was on her feet now. You want to know what a criminal looks like, Victor Hale? A man in leather. It's a man in a $5,000 coat who puts his own adjuster on storm claims to stall them, moves banks to foreclose, and burns down barns when old men won't sell. Dead silence on the line. Hale said finally, and all the softness was gone. The mask was off completely now, and what was left was cold and quiet and genuinely dangerous. For little woman, you've been digging. All right, let me be very clear with you since we're done pretending. His voice dropped. I have spent a great deal of time and money building something in this county and not going to let a widow and a pack of thugs unravel it. Of nothing. You have rumors and angry bikers and no money and no lawyer you can afford. They have all the time and all the money in the world. You will lose. And when you lose, I will not be offering you a fifth of what this land is worth anymore. I'll be buying it at auction for nothing. And you'll walk away with the clothes on your back. And you will have done it all to yourself. A pause. Offer is withdrawn. There is no way out for you now. Your last 2 days. The line went dead. Claire stood in the shelter, still against her ear, heart slamming. 2 days. He'd moved the deadline up. 2 days. And the terrible thing, the thing that made her stomach drop, was that he wasn't wrong about the raw facts. She didn't have money. She didn't have a lawyer she could pay. Trouble and Rooster and Boone had done incredible work, knowing Hale was a crook, and being able to stop him in 2 days were two different things entirely. The machine was still grinding, and the deadline was still coming, and the county was still in his pocket. She called Hawk. He moved the deadline, she said the second he picked up. 2 days, Hawk. He knows we've been digging, and he moved it to 2 days and withdrew the offer. And he says I have nothing. And he's not wrong. We know he's a crook, but knowing it doesn't stop the foreclosure, it doesn't unfreeze the insurance. It doesn't. She was starting to spiral, and she knew it. 2 days. What do we do in 2 days? There was a pause. Hawk spoke. His voice was calm. Completely, utterly calm. The calm of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. He said. Good? He moved the deadline because he's scared. Claire could hear the grim satisfaction in it. Scared men make mistakes. Scared men rush. And a rushing man leaves tracks. A pause. Claire, I need you to trust me now. Can you do that? Everything. Can you trust me for 2 more days? Yes. I trust you. But Hawk, 2 days is enough. His voice was iron. Here's what I need from you. You do not leave that property. You do not sign one single thing, no matter who shows up, or what they say, no matter what deadline they wave in your face. Comes back, if the bank comes, if the sheriff himself comes with a piece of paper, you call me, and you sign nothing. You understand? I understand. And one more thing. She could hear something in his voice now, building, something enormous. The morning of the deadline. Day after tomorrow. Whatever Hale's got planned, and he's going to have something planned, he's going to want to be there to watch you break. I need you standing in that yard. Head up. You don't hide in the shelter. You stand in your husband's yard, and you face that man. And no matter how it looks, no matter how alone you feel, hold your ground. A pause. Can you do that? Can you stand in that yard and hold your ground for me? Claire looked out toward the dark highway. The wreckage of Daniel's shop. Caught her the empty road where her neighbors had driven past. Their car had come and gone, where a machine had been grinding her down for 3 weeks. Hawk, she said. What's going to happen the morning of the deadline? And Hawk was quiet for a long moment. You saved 10 of us, he said finally. You held one door open, in the worst storm in 40 years, because a dead man told you people matter more than things. His voice thickened. You've spent 3 weeks thinking you were alone out there, thinking nobody was coming, thinking you had to hold at that door by yourself all over again. A pause. And Claire, you were never alone. Not for 1 minute of these 3 weeks. Just couldn't see us yet. Hawk, 2 days, he said. Stand in that yard and you'll see. The line went dead. The next 2 days were the longest of Claire's life. Pressure kept coming. Hale had 2 days too, and he used them. Twice more. A man Claire didn't recognize sat in a car at the end of her driveway for 3 hours one afternoon, just watching, and drove off when she walked toward him. The insurance company sent formal notice that her claim had been denied, flat denied, exactly as Hale had promised weeks ago, the letter arriving with a cruelty that felt almost personal. And the night before the deadline, someone drove past slow in the dark and threw a bottle that shattered against the shelter door. Claire sat inside with her heart in her throat and Daniel's old shotgun across her knees and did not sleep at all. She didn't sign anything, and she didn't call anyone except Hawk, plumbers who answered every single time. Laura Knight said the same thing every time. Hold your ground, sign nothing. I'm coming. Stand in that yard. Almost broke a dozen times. In the dark alone, with the denial letter on the cot beside her and a broken bottle outside the door, and a man in an expensive coat who had all the money and all the lawyers and all the time in the world, it seemed insane to keep fighting. It seemed insane to stake everything on the word of a biker 2 states away who kept telling her to stand in a yard. Every reasonable voice she had, the town's voice, Elaine's voice, the voice that had kept her small and safe and alone for 3 years, screamed at her to just sell, just take whatever pennies Hale would still give her and walk away with the clothes on her back and start over somewhere warm and easy where nobody had ever heard the name Whitmore. And every time she thought about the door, she thought about the night she'd stood with her hand on the light switch, one flip away from sitting in the dark, while 10 men and a boy died 200 feet away. About how close she'd come to being the person the town raised her to be careful. Frightened, closed, and she thought about how the bravest thing she'd ever done wasn't holding the door. It was trusting that the men on the other side of it wouldn't hurt her. She'd been right that night, against everything she'd been taught, against every instinct, against the whole weight of the town. She'd been right. So she chose to be right again. The morning of the deadline came gray and cold. Claire got up off Daniel's cot where she hadn't slept. She washed her face in the little sink. She put on Daniel's flannel shirt, the one she wore when she needed to feel him near her, and she looked at the 4 rescued photographs on the shelf, and she looked at the water-stained card, and she walked out of the shelter into the cold morning, exactly as Hawk had told her to, and she stood in the yard. She stood in Daniel's yard, in the wreckage of everything they'd built, and she waited. She didn't have to wait long. The black car came first, right on time, gliding up the highway and pulling into the ruined lot. Their Hale got out, and behind his car came 2 more lawyers. Claire understood, men in suits with briefcases, and behind them a bank official she recognized as Fenley, soft and sorry, and there to collect. Hale walked across the lot toward her with a smile that had every tooth in it and not 1 ounce of warmth. Then come to watch a widow break, a man who had never once in his life been told no by someone who could make it stick. Mrs. Whitmore. He stopped in front of her, and he looked at her standing alone in the wreckage in her dead husband's shirt. His smile widened. I did tell you it would come to this. I take no pleasure in it, but you brought this on yourself. He gestured. One of the lawyers stepped forward with a document and a pen. Property reverts to auction at noon today. But I'm a generous man. I'll honor a version of my original offer if you sign right now and save us all the trouble. It's the last kindness you'll get from me or anyone. Sign and walk away with something. Refuse and walk away with nothing. He held out the pen. Your neighbors aren't coming, Mrs. Whitmore. Your church isn't coming. There'll be left to save you. It's just you and me. Claire, sign it. Claire looked at the pen. She looked at Victor Hale. She looked at the empty highway behind him, gray and silent in the cold morning, the same highway where her neighbors had driven past, Plum Highway, where a storm had once brought 10 men to her door. Claire Whitmore did not take the pen. No, she said. A little smile flickered. Mrs. Whitmore, be reasonable. I said no. Her voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in 3 years. You can take your pen, Claire, and your lawyers and your soft-spoken banker, and you can wait until noon, and you can find out what my land's really worth. She lifted her chin. Because I'm not alone, Mr. Hale. I know it looks like I am. like I am for 3 years. But you made one mistake, a mistake this whole town made, about those men you called criminals. She almost smiled. Looked at me standing alone in a yard, and you thought that's all there was. Hale's face began to change. In the silence after Claire's words, something had entered the cold morning air. Something low, something distant. A sound at the very edge of hearing, coming from far up the highway, from everywhere, a sound that made the lawyers turn their heads, and the banker frown, and Victor Hale go slowly, incredibly still. A sound Claire knew, a sound like thunder that would not stop. Vengeance, the sound grew. At first Victor Hale tried to ignore it. Claire watched him do it, watched him force the smile back onto his face. Claire watched him lift the pen again like the thunder building on the horizon was nothing. A passing truck, a trick of the wind. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, and his voice was tight now. Whatever theatrics you've arranged won't change the facts. The auction is at noon, is the law. A little noise doesn't, the noise doubled, then tripled. It stopped being a sound at the edge of hearing and became a thing you felt in your chest, on the ground under your boots, a low rolling thunder that came up the highway from both directions at once, and did not stop and did not fade and only grew, and grew and grew. One of the lawyers turned all the way around. Well, he said uncertainly, Mr. Hale, what is that? Hale didn't answer. Color was staring up the highway, and the color was draining out of his face, because they were coming into view now. The first bikes crested the rise to the north, a handful of them, lights on in the gray morning, and Claire's heart leapt because she recognized the shape of the man in front, even at that distance, eyes of him, the way he sat the bike like a mountain that had decided to move. Doc. And beside him, Diesel, and behind them, Doc, and there was Mitch, healed enough to ride, and Noah, who'd asked if he was dead, alive and whole, and coming up the highway toward the woman who'd held the door, who'd survived the storm. And then Claire understood that the 10 were only the front. Was behind them, cresting the rise, came behind those more. The bikes kept coming over the hill, 2 by 2, then 4 across, then filling the whole width of the highway shoulder to shoulder, a river of chrome and leather pouring down toward her, and it wasn't stopping. The rise kept giving up more of them, rank after rank after rank, and from the south, the same thing was happening, the river coming up the other way, and the thunder of it was so enormous, now that the lawyers had their hands halfway to their ears, and Fenley the banker had gone the color of paste. How many? One of the lawyers said, and his voice cracked. Hell, how many of them are there? They came off the rise and did not stop coming. 50. 100. Claire lost the ability to count somewhere past 200, and they were still coming, still pouring over the hill, still filling the highway from both directions, and the sound had become something almost holy, a wall of sound. Whitmore stood in the wreckage of her dead husband's shop with tears streaming down her face because she had spent 3 weeks believing she was alone. And here was the truth of it coming up the highway at her from horizon to horizon. Otto, you were never alone, Hawk had said. You just couldn't see us yet. Riders reached the lot and began to fill it, bike after bike, rolling in and stopping and killing their engines. And the men swung off and stood, and still the others came. Filling the highway now, for as far as Claire could see in both directions, an unbroken mass of riders that stretched past the bend to the north and past the bend to the south and kept going out of sight. The ones who couldn't fit in the lot lined the shoulders and lined the road and simply stood, cold, silent, now that the engines were dying. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and every single one of them was looking at Victor Hale. More than 1,000 of them. They had come from 4 states. They had come, Claire would learn later, driving through the night, some of them riding 12 hours, 14, others that had never met each other, men who'd only ever heard the name Whitmore as a story, passed rider to rider. There's a woman out on a highway who opened her door and they had all, everyone turned their bikes toward a stretch of road most of them had never seen, to stand in a widow's yard on the morning a rich man came to break her. Got off his bike. He walked across the lot toward Claire. Riders parted for him. without a word. And he was smiling now, a real smile, the first real smile she'd ever seen on that weathered face. And he came and stood beside her and turned to face Victor Hale. And he said, in a voice that carried across the silent lot, Hale couldn't speak. You must be Hale. Hawk looked him up and down, slow taking in the expensive coat, the lawyers, burst out the thumb still frozen in the man's hand. You know, I've been hearing your name for 2 weeks now. Heard it from a widow you tried to rob. Heard it from a paralegal who found your name on an adjuster's payroll. Heard it from a retired deputy who's been following your work for years. Hawk's smile didn't waver, and that was the terrifying part, the smile. Been real curious to meet the man brave enough to threaten a woman standing alone in the wreckage of her husband's life. And here you are. Doesn't look like much, does he? Does? A low sound moved through the 1,000 riders. White laughter. Something harder. This is... Hale found his voice. Holy, this is intimidation. This is a mob. I have lawyers here. I have witnesses. You can't. You people have no right. We're not doing anything, Hawk said mildly. Around. Nobody's touched you. Nobody said a threatening word. We're just standing here. It's a free country, last I checked. A man can stand on a public road. He spread his hands to support our friend Claire on a hard morning. Oh, isn't that right, Claire? That's right, Claire said. And her voice didn't shake at all. See, the thing is, Mr. Hale, and here Hawk stopped smiling, and his voice dropped. Every rider in that silent lot leaned in to hear it. You made a real bad bet. You looked at a woman alone on a highway, and you thought, hey, behind her, easy pickings. Storm took her shop. It's back. Her husband, Lee, no lawyer. Mark. He shook his head slowly. But you didn't do your homework. Because this particular woman, 3 weeks ago, opened her door in the worst storm in 40 years and saved 10 men's lives. And his voice rose, and it carried now to the back of that 1,000-strong crowd. It turns out that when you save 10 of us, you don't just save 10 of us, you save every brother of every one of those 10. You save their fathers and their sons. You put us all in your debt. We do not forget a debt. He looked out at the sea of riders. Do we? And 1,000 voices answered him at once. A single roar that rolled across the lot and up the highway and shook the very air. No, and Victor Hale flinched like he'd been struck. It was into that silence, after the roar died, that the woman with the notebook stepped forward. Claire hadn't noticed her arrive. The riders somehow, or just behind them, a small, sharp-eyed woman in a plain coat with a recorder in one hand and a photographer at her shoulder. She walked into the lot with the fearless purpose of someone who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this morning. There, Hale, she said. Elena Delgado. I'm with the county ledger. I'm trying to reach you for comment for about a year now. She lifted the recorder. I'm running a story this week. Maybe you can help me get some details right. Hale's face, pale, now went gray. I've got documents, Delgado went on, conversational, relentless, showing that your company kept an insurance adjuster named Rennick on a private consulting retainer for 18 months. Records showing that same adjuster was assigned to every major storm claim on properties your company later purchased. She nodded at Claire Mrs. Whitmore's, a pattern across 3 states going back 6 years. Foster hits, claims get stalled by adjusters connected to you. Banks you have relationships with move to foreclose, and you buy the ruined land for a fraction of its value. Like to comment on that? No comment, Hale said. Oh, was barely a whisper. I've got the Petersons on the record, Delgado said. Wolskies. 3 weeks ago, they were too scared to talk to me. Anything. She glanced around at the 1,000 riders. They're not scared anymore. I wonder why that is. She flipped a page. I've also got a retired deputy named Boone, who's connected your name to a barn fire 2 counties south, in a case involving another landowner who wouldn't sell. That one's not a civil matter, Mr. Hale. That parties are going to be very interested. Me? In fact, and here she smiled, thin and sharp, I made a call this morning. Already interested. You might want to expect some visitors. Hale's lawyers had gone very still. One of them leaned in and said something low and urgent in Hale's ear. Claire watched the developer's face, and she watched the exact moment the man understood that the machine he'd built for other people had just closed its jaws on him. Because that was the thing about a machine like Hale's. It ran on secrecy. It ran on isolated, frightened people who each thought they were alone, who never compared notes, who took the pennies and slunk away in shame. Not survive 1,000 witnesses and a reporter with a notebook and a paper trail and victims who'd found their courage. It could not survive the light, and Claire Whitmore had brought the light. You, Hale said. He turned to her, and the mask was entirely gone now, and what was left underneath was small and cornered and afraid. You did this. You, a widow with a broken-down repair shop. I opened a door, Claire said quietly. 3 weeks ago, in a storm. That's all I did. I opened a door for 10 men everybody told me to be afraid of. She looked out at the 1,000 riders filling the highway from horizon to horizon. Beside her, at Noah, alive in the crowd, Diesel and Pope and Doc and Mitch, a legal Sandra, who'd driven up to see it end, the reporter with her notebook. And it turns out that when you do one good thing for the right people, her voice broke. Well, she kept going. It comes back. Not because you asked, because you earned it. Just because there are still people in this world who don't forget. She met Hale's eyes. You spent your whole life betting that people are alone. Your whole business, Mr. Hale. Betting that people are alone and scared and there's nobody behind them. She shook her head. You bet wrong. On me, you bet wrong. It fell apart for Victor Hale very fast after that. Parties did come, not that day, but within the week, and again, and then with warrants. Delgado's story ran on the front page under a headline that Claire would keep a copy of for the rest of her life, and the story was picked up. And then it was everywhere. And the Petersons talked, and the Kowalskis talked, and the young couple with the greenhouse talked. Once the first few victims saw that they were not alone, that a whole army had stood in a widow's yard, fate had come and the sky had not fallen, the rest of them found their voices too. And fire got reopened. The adjuster Rennick, faced with charges of his own, said he'd rather talk than take the fall alone. And what he had to say turned the investigation into something Hale's expensive lawyers could not paper over. Well, Hale's development company, which had been built on the wreckage of other people's disasters, apart the way such things do slowly and then all at once, that had been so eager to foreclose for him, discovered a sudden strong preference for distance. Many officials who'd flagged Claire's permits found their own names in the reporter's follow-up stories and became, tonight, extremely interested in doing everything by the book. And Victor Hale himself, the man who had told Claire that he always got the land he wanted, always, and that the only choice she had was how much it cost her to fight him. Victor Hale spent the following months learning exactly how much it cost him in a series of proceedings that Claire followed from the beginning to the end, that ended with the man in the expensive coat losing a great deal more than a single widow's stretch of highway. That came later. That morning in the lot, Hale had gotten into his black car with his lawyers and driven away past 1,000 riders who simply watched him go in total silence. It was somehow more frightening than any shout. Once the dust of his leaving had settled, Claire Whitmore turned around and found herself facing an army. There's than 1,000 men filling her yard and the highway in both directions, every one of them looking at her. And she didn't know what to say. She'd spent 3 weeks alone in a shelter. She'd spent 3 years alone on a highway. She had forgotten, somewhere in all that loneliness, what it felt like to be seen. And here were 1,000 people who'd ridden through the night to see her, and the size of it, the sheer impossible weight of it, pulled her knees. Hawk caught her elbow. Easy, he said quietly. Not you. Hawk. She was crying and she didn't care. Why would these men don't even know me? All night, some of them. For a woman they never met. Why? Because that's what you did, Hawk said simply. You never met Noah before you held that door for him. You never met me before you ran out into that storm. But you did it anyway for strangers because it was right. He looked out at the 1,000 faces. You think you're the only one who was ever taught that? You think you invented it? He smiled. You just reminded us. Claire, That's all. You reminded a whole lot of men who spend their lives being called criminals what it looks like when somebody treats you like a human being. Sure. And a thing like that, his voice roughened, a thing like that travels. You have no idea how far a thing like that travels. And then Noah pushed through the crowd the boy, alive, whole, grinning like the sun, and he threw his arms around Claire and lifted her clean off her feet. Behind him came Diesel with his gentle hands, and Pope, who'd shown her a photo of his daughter's missing tooth in the dark of the storm, and Mitch walking without a crutch now. And they surrounded her, and she'd saved, and the 1,000 behind them raised a sound that wasn't a roar this time, but something warmer that rolled up the highway like a wave. And Claire Whitmore stood in the wreckage of her old life, at the center of a family she had never expected and never asked for, and could never in 1,000 years have imagined. About the night of the storm, about her hand on the light switch, how close she'd come to flipping it off and sitting in the dark. Claire, people are more important than things, Claire. Everything else is just weather. Okay, Daniel, she whispered into the noise of the crowd, called bright morning. Okay, I hear you. They didn't leave. That was the thing Claire hadn't understood, the thing that took the rest of the day to sink in. Well, she'd thought in whatever part of her still expected the worst that they'd come, they'd stand, they'd frighten hail off, and then the thunder would roll back up the highway and fade the way it had faded the morning after the storm, and she'd be alone again in the wreckage, victorious but alone. They didn't leave. Instead, sometime around mid-morning, Diesel walked over to the fallen oak still lying across the ruins of the shop. The tree that had crushed Daniel's life's work put his hands on his hips and said to nobody in particular, well, this ain't gonna move itself. And then 100 men walked over and moved it. There, watched them do it. Watched them swarm the wreckage the way they'd swarmed the highway. Watched them find, among 1,000 riders, every skill a person could need. The men who'd fixed transmissions, and the men who'd framed houses, and the men who'd run wire and laid pipe and poured concrete. Ordinary men with ordinary trades, more of them than any contractor could dream of hiring. And every one of them, working for free, working for a debt, working for a widow they'd mostly never met. Hawk, Claire said. Hawk, what are they? I can't pay for, nobody's asking you to pay for anything. But the permits are still blocked. The county, Hawk said dryly, is going to be extremely accommodating about your permits by this afternoon. A reporter's front page story about corruption does wonders for a permit office's sense of urgency. Sandra's already down there. She says, by end of day, you'll have every approval you need. All backdated, all clean. He almost smiled. Funny how fast things move once folks aren't scared anymore. And it was true. Colorado's, by the end of that first day, the wreckage was cleared, was gone, the debris was hauled off, and where the ruin of Whitmore Auto Repair had stood there was a swept and level foundation ready to build on, and 1,000 men had turned Claire's yard from a graveyard into a construction site who'd spent 3 weeks digging through rubble alone, with her bare hands, stood in the middle of it and could not stop crying. Not sad crying. She wanted to be clear about that later when she told the story. It wasn't sad crying. It was the other kind. The kind she'd forgotten existed at night, the ones who could stay built fires in the lot, and someone had a guitar, and Claire sat on an overturned crate, wrapped in a blanket between Hawk and Noah. And for the first time in 3 years, she was not alone in the dark on that highway. She was surrounded by light and by voices, and by men who'd once been the things she feared most in the world. About how strange it was, how completely upside down, the safest she had felt since Daniel died was in the middle of 1,000 Hell's Angels. Ask you something? She said to Hawk, sometime late, fires had burned down. Ask that night. In the shelter, you gave me that card. You made me promise to call. She looked at him. That it would come to this? That I'd need all of this? Hawk was quiet for a while, putting the fire. No, he said finally. I didn't know about hail. Insurance or the bank or any of it. He turned to look at her. I knew this town had already left you once. You told me. In the shelter. You said your own people left you out in the cold after Daniel died. He shrugged his huge shoulders. I thought, a woman that good, alone out here, surrounded by folks that already showed her they won't come when it's hard. Oh, somebody ought to give her a number that gets answered. He looked back at the fire. I didn't know what was coming, Claire. I just knew I never wanted you to be alone in the cold again. The card ever was. A promise that somebody would answer. Claire didn't say anything for a long moment. Hers? Then she said, it got answered. It got answered, Hawk agreed. 1 times over. The town first noticed. You cannot have 1,000 motorcycles roll into a county without the town noticing. Claire braced herself for the whispers, for Marlene's calls, for Pastor Reeves and Deputy Dunphy, and all the careful, frightened voices that had run her life for so long. Braced herself to be talked about. She'd told Hawk she was ready for it before any of this, and she'd meant it. But something happened that she had not braced for, and changed its mind. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way the ice had melted after the storm, slowly, then faster. Because the town read Delgado's story too, and learned that the criminals in the widow's yard had exposed a man who'd been quietly robbing storm victims across 3 states, including whole families right there in their own county who'd been too ashamed to say a word. Learned that the men they'd crossed the street to avoid had done, for free, what the town's own institutions had failed to do. They'd protected one of their own. And the town, which had driven past Claire Whitmore in her hour of need not once but twice, slowly, shamefacedly to come back. Gus Pruitt came first. He drove out one afternoon in the same truck that had sped past her the morning after the storm, and he sat in the cab for a long minute before he got out. And when he finally walked over to where Claire was working, alongside a dozen riders framing the new shop, he couldn't quite meet her eyes. Claire, he said. Oh. He looked at the ground. That morning, near the storm, I drove past you. He forced himself to look up. Saw you standing there in the wreckage, and I saw them bikes, and I got scared, and I drove past you, and you needed help, and I drove past. I've been sick about it for 3 weeks, and I finally read that gal's article, and his voice cracked. That old man who ran the feed store. I'm ashamed. There, Claire. I'm just ashamed. I don't expect you to forgive it. I brought my tools, and I'd like to help build, if you'll let me, if it's not too late to be the kind of neighbor I should have been. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and then she thought about Daniel and about doors, how the whole terrible, beautiful thing had started because she'd chosen to open one instead of closing it. Never too late, Gus, she said. Grab a hammer. And Gus Pruitt wept. Right there in the yard, and picked up a hammer and went to work beside the men he'd been afraid of. And something that had been broken in that town for a very long time began quietly to mend. Others followed. Doris from the diner came with food, enough food for 100, and then came back the next day with more. Who'd avoided the highway for 3 years, drove out with lumber and lemonade and their kids. And the kids stared wide-eyed at the bikes, and the bikers taught them how to hold a level straight, and neighbors who'd never once stopped for a grieving widow stood shoulder to shoulder with Hell's Angels and hammered nails into the frame of a new building. And the whole strange, impossible sight of it made Claire understand something she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people. The men her town had feared had not just rebuilt her shop. They had rebuilt her town. They'd shown a whole community, ever once lecturing anybody, that the labels people slapped on strangers were mostly lies. The dangerous men were the ones who came when it was hard. Frightened, careful voice that told you to lock your door and drive past and stay small and safe and alone. That voice was the real danger, in the end, because it had almost cost Claire 10 lives on the night of the storm. It's the town 3 years of a good woman's loneliness, and it had let a man like Victor Hale operate for years, feeding on isolated, frightened people who each believed they had nobody behind them. An open door had undone all of it. Weeks passed. The frame went up, and the walls, and then the roof, a better roof than the old one, framed by men who knew what a 40-year storm could do and built for the next one. Stayed longer than the others. Most of the 1,000 had ridden home within a few days, back to their own lives. their own jobs, their own families. The core of them remained, the 10 and a handful more. They worked alongside Claire until the thing was nearly done. On the day they hung the new sign, the whole town came out. Claire had thought about that sign for weeks. Daniel had lettered the old one himself, crushed and buried, and she'd grieved it like she'd grieved everything else. Standing in front of the finished shop with 1,000 memories and 10 men who'd become her family in a town that had finally come home, she'd understood that the old name wasn't quite right anymore. It wasn't just hers and Daniel's now. It had been saved by too many hands, opened up to too many strangers, to carry only the old name. When they raised the new sign, it read, "The Open Door Garage." Underneath, are letters. In Claire's own hand, "Everyone welcome, especially the ones you were told to fear." Huck stood beside her as they raised it, and he read it. Oh, and he didn't say anything for a long time. And then he put his huge arm around her shoulders, the way he had in the wreckage on that first cold morning. Claire leaned into him, and the two of them looked up at the sign together while the town and the club and the family never expected cheered below. "Like that," Hawk said, Daniel. "He'd have liked that sign." "Yeah," Claire said. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "Yeah, he would have." She thought about the night it all began. Put the emergency alert screaming across her phone. Her hand on the light switch, one flip away from the dark. The engines on the empty highway, and the boy who didn't get up, and the dead man's voice in her chest, telling her that people mattered more than things. About how the whole town had told her those men were dangerous. About how, in the end, the most dangerous thing in the world had almost been her own fear, the fear that had nearly kept her behind a locked door while 10 men froze. There's the fear that had nearly made her sell her husband's land to a vulture rather than ask for help. The fear that had kept the whole town driving past a grieving widow for 3 long years. An open door had beaten all of it. Claire Whitmore looked up at the sign her friends had hung. The family her one act of kindness had brought her. At the highway where 1,000 riders had once come thundering to her defense. And for the first time, in a very long time, standing in the middle of everyone, she was not afraid of anything at all. The first customer came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after they hung the sign. Claire almost didn't recognize what was happening. She was under a truck when she heard tires on the gravel. Her whole body tensed the old way, the 3 years alone way, bracing for a black car or a courier or bad news. Then a voice called out, uncertain, "Hello? Is somebody you open?" And Claire rolled out from under the truck and stood up and looked at a nervous young man standing in the doorway of a shop that had been a pile of rubble 2 months ago. Understood that she was in fact open. "We're open," she said. Her voice cracked a little on it because it was the first time she'd said those words in a business Daniel would have recognized. "Man, what have you got?" The young man's water pump had gone. It was a 20-minute fix and an easy one, and Claire did it while he watched. And when she was done and he asked what he owed her, almost said nothing, almost gave it away the way it had all been given to her. But then she thought about Daniel, always said a shop that doesn't charge isn't a shop. It's a charity, and both are fine, but you'd best know which one you're running. 40, she said, for the part and the labor. He paid it, and drove off, and Claire stood in the doorway of the open-door garage, holding the first 220s she'd earned in 3 months, laughed out loud, alone, in the sun, because she'd done it. She'd actually done it. She was still standing there when Hawk's bike came up the highway. Oh, finally, a few weeks back they all had, last of them, once the shop was built and the town had come home and there was nothing left to guard her from. Claire had thought that would be the end of it. She'd braced for it. She braced for everything, told herself the family was always going to scatter, eventually, that men had their own lives, that she couldn't expect 1,000 riders to adopt one widow forever. At herself, she'd be all right, alone again. The shop was standing. She'd been wrong about that too, as they kept coming back. Not 1,000 at a time, or 5. Pope came through on a run and stopped for 2 days and fixed her generator and showed her 40 new photos of Rose. whose tooth had grown back in. Doc rolled in one afternoon, and it turned out he'd been thinking about her tetanus situation, her working under old trucks, and he wouldn't leave until she'd been to a clinic. There's Mitch came just to sit in the shop and talk, because the boy who'd nearly died on her highway had decided Claire Whitmore was some kind of second mother, and he wasn't wrong, and she didn't correct him. And Hawk came the most. Heard you had your first customer. He said, now, swinging off the bike, Claire realized he'd timed it, that Mitch or somebody had called him, that this man had ridden hours to be here for a water pump. Or bucks. She held up the 20s. I'm basically a tycoon. Careful. Hawk grinned. Money changes people. They sat in the shop that afternoon the way they'd sat by the fire that first night. Easy, quiet, two people who'd stopped needing to fill the silence. Claire looked at this man, this enormous, terrifying, gray-bearded man her whole town had taught her to fear, and she thought about how he'd become the closest friend she'd had since Daniel died. The whole shape of her grief had changed. She still missed her husband, always miss her husband, but the missing didn't hollow her out anymore. The hollow place had filled up with people. I tell you something, she said, and you can't laugh at me. No promises. For 3 years after Daniel died, she turned the 20s over in her hands. The best part of my life was over, that I'd already had it. Of the shop, the whole thing, and now I was just going to run out the clock alone out here on this highway. I made my peace with it. I really did. She looked, and then 10 men crashed into my life in a blizzard. And I've never felt more alive than I do now. At 51 years old, I feel more alive now than I did at 30. Her voice went thick. How does that happen? How does a person's whole life open back up when she thought it was closing? Hawk was quiet for a while. Opened a door, he said finally. That's how. He spends so much time worrying about what might come through a door that they lock it, and then they sit alone in the dark on the other side of it. It's safe, and they call it living. He shook his head. You opened yours. On the worst night of the year, to the worst people you could imagine, you opened it anyway. It turned out the thing everybody was so scared of. He spread his hands, taking in the shop, the highway himself. It was a family. Always a family. People just kept the door shut too long to find out. The story got out. Claire never sought it. She wanted that on the record. When people asked. She never called anybody, never chased it, never wanted to be famous. But Elena Delgado's original reporting on Victor Hale had traveled in the traveling. A bigger story took shape underneath the corruption story. And one afternoon, a producer from a television program in the city called the shop and asked if Claire Whitmore would be willing to tell people about the night 10 Hell's Angels came to her door. Claire almost said no. The old fear don't make a fuss. Be seen, stay small, reared up one last time. Then Noah, who happened to be at the shop that day, said you should do it. Why? Because there's some kid out there right now. The boy who'd asked if he was dead looked at her. Dead serious. Some kid who's about to freeze on somebody's highway. And some woman who's about to hear engines and reach for the light switch. If you tell people what happened, maybe she opens the door instead. He shrugged. So she did it. She sat under the lights and told a stranger with a microphone the whole thing, the way she'd have told Daniel. The alert on her phone, on the switch, the engines, the boy who didn't get up, her husband's voice in her chest. People are more important than things. Opened the door, and Noah, blue-lipped in the snow, asking if he was dead, crushed to nothing by morning. And Hale and the machine, their stained card she'd sat on for 3 weeks out of pride, and the 1,000 engines coming up the highway from horizon to horizon. On the morning, she'd finally learned she was never alone. The interview aired, and the thing that happened next, Eddie could have planned. The letters started coming. Then actual people, driving out to the highway, of them from states away, just to stand in the lot where it happened and shake Claire's hand. One came who'd lost her husband the same year Claire lost Daniel and had spent every year since alone. She held Claire's hands and cried and said, I locked my door. Whole life, I locked my door. I don't want to anymore. A trucker came who'd been at his lowest, ready to do something he wouldn't name. And he said the story had turned him around. Well, if a widow could open her door to 10 bikers, he could hold on one more day. There's kids came, old men came, people who'd never ridden a motorcycle and people who'd ridden their whole lives. And every one of them had heard the story, and every one of them had felt the same thing loosen in their chest that had loosened in Claire's. But each stood slowly what her one open door had really done. It hadn't just saved 10 men. It hadn't just saved her land. It had become a thing people held on to, a proof, small, hard piece of evidence in a frightened world. This, that the strangers you were told to fear might be the ones who'd stand beside you. That one act of kindness on the worst night of your life might come back 1,000-fold on the morning you needed it most. There was one more thing. It came almost a year to the day after the storm, and it was the twist that Claire never saw coming. The last piece that made the whole terrible, beautiful shape of it finally make sense. Then came to the shop, older than Claire, worn, with careful, frightened eyes that Claire recognized instantly because she'd seen them in the mirror for 3 years. She stood in the doorway a long time before she came in, the way people did who weren't sure they were allowed. And when she finally spoke, her voice shook. "Are you Claire Whitmore?" "I am." The woman's hands were trembling. "I don't know how to say this. I've been trying to work up to it for months. I saw you on the television." She swallowed. "My name is Ruth." She looked at the floor. "My husband was the insurance adjuster. There's Rennick. He worked for Victor Hale on the side." She forced herself to look up. "We went to prison because of what you started. And I came to..."
Claire's whole body had gone still.
She'd braced in that first instant for anger. For a wife come to blame her. To say you ruined my husband. You destroyed my family. This is your fault. She'd braced for it the way she braced for everything. That wasn't what Ruth Calder had come to say. "I came to thank you," the woman whispered. And then she was crying. "I didn't know. All those years, I didn't know what he was doing. He told me it was consulting. He told me it was legal. And I believed him because it was easier to believe him than to ask questions. And I let him be that man for years because I didn't want to know." She pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. "And then you opened your door to 10 strangers and you wouldn't sell and you called your friends and you brought the whole thing down. I finally had to look at what my husband was, what I'd let him be." She wiped her eyes. "I mean, he's a better man in prison than he was free. He's ashamed now. He writes me letters, real ones. The man I married before the money got him. I'm Mrs. Whitmore. I know it sounds crazy, but you saved my family too. You saved us from what we were becoming. And I had to drive out here and tell you that." For a long moment, Claire couldn't speak because this was the thing she never could have imagined. Standing with her hand on the light switch on the night of the storm, opening one door for 10 freezing men would ripple out so far, so long-sung into so many lives, that it would even reach the family of the man who'd tried to destroy her, and mend something there too. That kindness could travel that far. A single choice, could in terror, old, stone, could reach a full year and 100 miles down the line and put its hand on a stranger's shoulder and say it's not too late for you either. "Ruth," Claire said. She came around the counter and she took the woman's shaking hands the way Hawk had once taken hers. "Here, come in, sit down." She looked at this frightened, worn woman with the careful eyes. And she said the thing she'd learned, the thing the whole story had been trying to teach her from the first night. "Well, you don't have to lock your door anymore. Whatever you were, whatever he was, that's done. You get to open it now. You hear me? It's never too late to open the door." And Ruth Calder, wife of the man who'd tried to help ruin her, sat down in the open-door garage and let a stranger be kind to her. And something that had been locked in her for years came open at last. Claire told that part of the story to Hawk when he came through. He listened to all of it. He always listened, quiet and complete. And when she was done, he didn't say anything for a long while. He just looked at her across the shop she'd rebuilt, the town that had come home, in the life that had opened back up when she'd been sure it was closing forever. "You know what you are?" he said finally. "What?" "You're the bravest person I ever met." He said it plain. No joke in it, and I've known some brave people. Men who'd ride into anything. Men who'd take any beating and not make a sound. He shook his head. There. But you were scared, Claire. That's the thing. Well, you were scared the whole time. Scared that night on the highway to hold that door. Scared to call the number. Scared to stand in that yard. You were scared of every single thing you did. He leaned forward. You did all of it anyway. That's the only brave that counts. The rest is just people who don't feel fear. You felt it. And you opened the door regardless. He sat back. Daniel knew what he had. Hope he knew. He knew, Claire said softly. He always knew. They sat with that for a moment. I've been thinking, Hawk said, about what you asked me. That day, why 1,000 men rode all night for a woman they never met. He looked out at the highway. Lobo, I gave you an answer, but it wasn't the whole one. He paused, choosing the words carefully. Most of those men spent their lives being told they were the danger. Something to lock the door against. Their whole lives. And then here's this woman who didn't just fail to lock the door. She ran out into a blizzard to drag us in out of it. All right, us, Claire. His voice caught. This huge, unbreakable man, you treated 10 men the world calls garbage like we were worth saving. Our lives mattered. And when a thing like that happens, he sees the human being under the patch after a lifetime of nobody bothering. He stopped. You come running, Claire finished quietly. Done. Hawk agreed. 1,000 of you, from 4 states. Because for once in your life, somebody looked at you and saw a person worth crossing a storm for. And you'd cross 100 storms to give that back to her. He wiped his eyes, ashamed of it. That's what you did, Claire. You didn't save 10 men in a blizzard. You gave 1,000 men their humanity back for one morning. That's why they came. The shop is still there. If you drive that highway today, 6 miles out of town, where the deer outnumber the people, a low building with 2 bay doors and a hand-lettered sign that reads the open door garage. Underneath, in a woman's careful hand, everyone welcome. Especially the ones you were told to fear. You'll find a widow named Claire Whitmore working under a truck, or now, gray coming into her hair. And you'll find, often than not, a motorcycle or 2 parked in the lot, and men in leather drinking coffee in the office and telling stories. And a town that once drove past her now stopping in just to say hello. And if you're the kind of person who's been sitting alone in the dark on the wrong side of a locked door grieving, or frightened or told your whole life to be scared of the wrong things, Claire will pour you a coffee and she'll tell you the story, the alert on the phone, the engines on the empty highway, the boy who didn't get up, Robin's voice in her chest, and the 1,000 riders who came thundering over the hill on the morning she finally learned she was never, ever alone. She'll tell you that the town called those men. She'll tell you the dangerous thing in the world turned out to be her own fear. And she'll tell you the one thing she knows now, the one thing the whole long night and everything after it taught her, the thing she'd want carved on her own stone someday next to Daniel's, tells you to lock the door. It always has, and it always will, and it will dress itself up as caution and call itself wisdom, and it will keep you safe and small and alone in the dark for the rest of your life if you let it. The reckless, terrifying, door-opening kind. Love is the only thing that ever changed anything. Whitmore opened one door on the worst night of her life, when every voice she had told her to close it. 10 strangers walked in out of the cold. And 1,000 walked back out of that cold to save her. That's what one open door can do. Open yours. The last time anyone saw them all together was the following winter. It was the anniversary. Nobody had planned it. Exactly, or maybe everybody had quietly without saying so. Because on the morning 1 year to the day after the storm, Claire heard the sound again, low and distant, and rolling up the highway from both directions at once. That had once meant terror and now meant only one thing, coming home. She walked out into the cold without her coat, the way she had that first night, and she stood in the lot of the open door garage and watched them come over the Rise Hawk in front, Diesel, up and Doc, and Mitch and Noah, and behind them more, and behind those, more until the highway filled up again the way it had a year before. From horizon to horizon, engines like thunder that wouldn't stop. Didn't come to fight anyone. This time, there was no hail, no bank, no machine. There was nothing to save her from anymore. They just came because she was theirs. Hawk swung off his bike and walked across the lot, and he was grayer now, a little slower, and so was she. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. They just looked at each other, the widow and the biker, the two people who'd met in the worst storm in 40 years and built a family out of the wreckage. Opened your coat this time, Hawk said finally, looking at her, shivering in the cold. Figured I wasn't going to freeze. Claire smiled. About 1,000 people to keep me warm. And then Noah was there, lifting her off her feet the way he always did, and Pope was showing her a photo of Rose losing another tooth. Hawk was already fussing about her, working outdoors, in the cold, and Mitch was grinning, and the whole impossible family of them closed around her, in the lot where it had all begun. The town came out to meet them, and Gus Pruitt brought coffee, and Doris brought food for 100. Highway that had once been the loneliest place in Claire Whitmore's world became, one morning, the fullest place on earth. Claire stood in the middle of all of it, about the woman she'd been a year ago, the one with her hand on the light switch, one flip from the dark, one choice from a life that would have run out its clock alone, about how sure that woman had been that the best part was over. She'd been so wrong, the best part hadn't been over. Best part hadn't even started yet. It had been waiting on the other side of a door she'd almost been too afraid to open. Huck came and stood beside her, the way he always did. Together they looked out at the sea of people who'd come the family that a single act of kindness had built out nothing on the coldest night of her life. You did this, he said quietly. We did this, Claire said.
Oh,
He shook his head, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't care. Always you. One door. Claire, you opened one door. And Claire Whitmore looked out at the 1,000 faces of the people she loved, the town that had come home, in the life that had opened all the way back up. And she knew he was right. One door. That was all it ever took. She had opened into a blizzard, afraid, alone with every voice she owned, telling her to keep it shut, and out of that one small terrified act of love had come all of this. A rescued boy, saved shop, a broken man brought to justice, a woman set free, a whole town taught to stop fearing the wrong things, and a family of 1,000 souls who would ride through any storm on earth to reach her. She would carry that knowledge to the end of her days, and she would give it away to everyone who ever walked through her door, and it would outlive her, and it would be the truest thing she ever knew. Her son, you never know what's waiting on the other side of the door you're most afraid to open. But it is never, ever the thing you were taught to fear. Almost always a family you haven't met yet, standing in the cold, waiting for someone brave enough to let them in. Claire Whitmore let them in, and they never let her stand in the cold again.